In the shadowy world of medieval medicine, death was often more a guess than a certainty. With no modern tools to confirm the absence of life, countless people were buried, not because they were dead, but because they seemed dead. The fear of premature burial haunted the minds of many, and for good reason. It happened far more often than we'd like to believe. In this video, we'll journey through the chilling reasons why being buried alive was a common and terrifying mistake in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, the boundary between life and death was anything but clear. Without the benefits of modern medical instruments, no stethoscopes, no electrocardiograms, no brain scans, physicians and caretakers had to rely entirely on what they could observe with their eyes and ears. And in many cases, what they didn't see or hear led to fatal errors. If a person was very still, not visibly breathing, or had a weak pulse, it was often assumed that they had passed away. But in reality, some of these individuals were merely in a deep state of unconsciousness, suffering from conditions that mimicked death with uncanny precision. For example, catalepsy, a nervous condition that causes rigid body posture and unresponsiveness, was entirely misunderstood in medieval times. A person in a cataleptic state could remain motionless for hours or even days, with slowed breathing and a heartbeat so faint that it was imperceptible to the human hand. Epilepsy, which was often thought to be a form of demonic possession, could also render someone unconscious for long periods. Fevers, infectious diseases, or certain types of poisoning could induce comas or states of shock that reduced vital signs to nearly undetectable levels. Hypothermia, though not well understood at the time, could also make the body cold and appear lifeless. And during times of famine or war, malnutrition often weakened the body to such a degree that a living person could appear dead simply from exhaustion. Medieval people did try to confirm death in ways that made sense to them. They would sometimes check for clouding in the eyes, or wait to see if rigor mortis set in. But even these signs were not foolproof. For instance, rigor mortis can take several hours to begin and might not be noticeable in all cases, and eye clouding can be caused by many conditions unrelated to death. In some cultures, they would place a feather near the person's nose to see if it moved with breath. Others would hold a mirror to the lips and wait for fog. But these methods, while creative, were highly unreliable, especially in a dimly lit, cold, or chaotic environment. There was also the influence of religion and superstition. Death was seen not only as a physical event, but also a spiritual transition. If someone seemed close to death or displayed eerie behavior, people might assume their soul had already left the body, even if they were technically still alive. In this way, cultural beliefs could reinforce medical misjudgments. Priests might give last rites not based on any clear diagnosis, but simply because the person looked dead. And in the absence of further signs of life, families would begin preparations for burial. The poor were especially vulnerable to premature burial. Without money for prolonged care or multiple medical opinions, they were often declared dead based on a single observation. In times of plague, when physicians were overwhelmed or unwilling to visit homes out of fear of infection, many deaths were declared from a distance or by untrained family members. Even the wealthy were not entirely safe. While they may have had better care, they too could fall victim to human error or mistaken assumptions, particularly during the chaos of war, famine, or widespread disease. Ultimately, the fragility of life in the Middle Ages was matched by the fragility of knowledge. With no sure way to measure the presence or absence of life, people relied on guesswork, tradition, and often fear. And in this environment of uncertainty, it was tragically easy for someone to be pronounced dead when they were not. Speed was often seen as a virtue when it came to handling the dead in the Middle Ages. But that speed could be deadly in itself. One of the most disturbing reasons people were buried alive during this time was the sheer urgency with which burials were carried out. Whether driven by fear of disease, religious customs, or a lack of medical understanding, medieval societies operated under the belief that once death was suspected, the body needed to be buried quickly, sometimes within hours. Plagues and epidemics played a major role in creating this hasty mindset. The most infamous example is the Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century, killing tens of millions of people. Cities and villages were overwhelmed by corpses. The stench of death was everywhere. Fear gripped the population, not just fear of dying, but fear that the dead could somehow spread the plague to the living. This idea wasn't entirely unfounded. While people didn't understand bacteria or viruses, they did observe that being near the sick and the dead often led to more illness. Without knowing why, they came to believe that corpses were dangerous, so they needed to be removed from homes and public spaces as quickly as possible. In this climate of panic, there was little time for reflection or careful examination. When someone collapsed, grew cold, or stopped responding, loved ones didn't always have the luxury to wait and see if the person would recover. Instead, they might be wrapped in burial cloth, placed in a coffin, and carried away to a mass grave. In many cases, whole families died within days, and neighbors, often equally terrified, would be the ones to report and dispose of the dead. There were few safeguards against premature burial in such chaos. The priority was containment, not accuracy. This problem wasn't limited to plagues. In many rural or impoverished areas, death was dealt with quickly, simply because people lacked the space or means to store bodies. There were no refrigerated morgues, no professional funeral homes. A body left out in the summer heat could rot within hours, drawing flies, rats, and disease. Out of both practical necessity and deep-seated fear of corruption, people rushed to bury the dead before decay could begin. But in doing so, they often buried people who were not yet truly gone. Religious beliefs also played a powerful role. Christianity, which dominated Europe in the Middle Ages, taught that the body should return to the earth as soon as possible, reflecting the biblical phrase, "Dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return." A quick burial was not just a health precaution, it was seen as a spiritual duty. Delaying burial was frowned upon and could be seen as disrespectful to the soul of the departed. In some traditions, it was even believed that a soul could not find peace until the body was laid to rest. Thus, the pressure to bury swiftly came not only from fear of illness, but from a deep desire to ensure spiritual salvation. There were also practical and legal pressures. The church often maintained strict burial schedules, especially in densely populated towns. Cemeteries had limited space, and the process of burying the dead had to be organized quickly to avoid backlog. Gravediggers and clergy might preside over dozens of burials in a single day, especially during times of crisis. In this atmosphere, the dead became numbers, another body to place in the ground. Confirming death thoroughly was a luxury few could afford. Even royal and noble families were not immune to the rush. In castles or courts, if a nobleman died of illness or injury, swift burial was often ordered to prevent rumors of poison or assassination. And since embalming was rare and crude at best, the smell of a decaying body could create political embarrassment. In such high-stakes environments, image and order were sometimes more important than truth. The tragic outcome of this culture of urgency was that some people were buried alive, not because no one cared, but because everyone believed they were doing the right thing, acting quickly, following custom, protecting the living, honoring the dead. It was a mistake, born from good intentions, misguided by fear and ignorance. And for those unfortunate souls who were only unconscious or gravely ill, the chance of being saved diminished with each hurried step towards the grave. In the absence of modern diagnostic tools, medieval people relied on improvised and often primitive methods to determine whether a person was truly dead. These so-called tests for death were a mixture of superstition, observation, and trial and error, and they varied widely across regions and cultures. What they all had in common, however, was their deeply unreliable nature. Many of the methods used could not distinguish between true death and states of unconsciousness, paralysis, coma, or extreme shock. Tragically, this meant that countless individuals were declared dead while they were still clinging to life. One of the most common techniques was to check for breath using rudimentary means. A feather would be held in front of the nose or mouth to detect movement from exhalation. In theory, if the feather did not stir, the person was not breathing. Another version involved placing a mirror or polished piece of metal beneath the nostrils and watching for fogging. But these methods were extremely imprecise, especially in cold environments or in cases where the person was breathing very shallowly. A weakened, unconscious person might not move enough air to disturb a feather or fog a mirror, leading observers to assume they had passed away. Another method involved pricking the skin with needles, knives, or sharp thorns to elicit a pain response. The theory was simple. A dead person would not react to pain. But this method ignored a critical fact. Many people in comas or states of catalepsy are completely unresponsive to external stimuli. Catalepsy in particular, a condition marked by muscular rigidity and a loss of awareness, could leave someone frozen in place, unable to react to anything, even though they were very much alive. People in this state could be mistaken for corpses, especially if their skin had paled or their body temperature had dropped. Some tests were more invasive, and frankly more cruel. Vinegar or hot wax might be poured into a person's mouth or onto their skin to see if they flinched. On rare occasions, boiling water or even red-hot pokers were brought near the body to provoke a reaction. These methods reflect the desperation and fear surrounding death, but they also highlight the lack of medical knowledge. The assumption was that if a person could not be shocked back to life, they must be gone for good. But many of these methods could easily inflict pain on someone who was still alive but unable to respond, essentially torturing people on the brink of death in an effort to confirm what wasn't certain. Other approaches leaned more toward ritual than science. Some believed that chanting certain prayers or speaking the deceased's name repeatedly could bring them back, should they be merely sleeping or under a spell. In parts of Europe, it was customary to place candles around the head of the deceased and watch for flickering, as if the soul might still be present. Still others believed that placing a live animal, such as a rooster, on the chest of the suspected corpse might reveal signs of life, as the weight or warmth of the animal could provoke a reaction. Needless to say, these methods were based more on folklore than physiology. Occasionally, medical practitioners, such as they were, would try more technical assessments. They might inspect the eyes for cloudiness or dilation, or touch the limbs to feel for stiffness, but rigor mortis does not set in immediately, and body temperature alone can be misleading. Many people lose warmth quickly after fainting or suffering trauma. There are recorded cases in which someone assumed to be dead was later found to have a pulse when touched again several hours later, but by then it was often too late. In times of plague, war, or disaster, the pressure to move quickly often meant that these already flimsy tests were performed hastily or skipped altogether. If a person didn't respond, they were considered gone. There was no time to wait, no second opinion to seek. In such moments, the community simply moved forward with burial, prioritizing the safety of the many over the uncertain fate of the one. The idea of waiting for a potential recovery seemed reckless, even selfish, when disease or danger loomed. All of these methods reflect the fear and confusion that surrounded death in the Middle Ages. People desperately wanted to avoid burying the living, but they also feared the consequences of delay. In this tragic balance, the body became an object of hurried examination and crude tests, its fate decided by flickering feathers, painful stimuli, and long-standing superstitions. These tests were not only ineffective, they were emblematic of a world that had not yet learned to understand the deep, quiet signs of life. Throughout the Middle Ages and even into the centuries that followed, chilling tales began to surface, stories of people who were believed to be dead, only to awaken after burial, or worse, be discovered after death had finally and painfully taken them underground. These accounts were not limited to folklore or ghost stories whispered by candlelight. Many were based on real discoveries, witnessed by grave diggers, monks, physicians, and horrified family members. The evidence was often found in the most haunting of places, the disturbed interiors of coffins. One of the most unsettling discoveries involved the presence of deep scratch marks on the inside of wooden coffins. When cemeteries were dug up to make room for new burials, or when old graves were disturbed for any reason, these telltale marks, etched into the lid by fingernails, served as silent screams from the grave. In some cases, the position of the body had changed. Corpses that had been neatly laid out were found turned over, with twisted limbs, broken fingernails, or blood in the mouth from frantic efforts to escape. These signs told a story more terrifying than any legend. The person had been alive when buried. Such cases were not rare enough to be dismissed as anomalies. During mass burials, especially in times of plague or war, there was little oversight and virtually no time for careful observation. Bodies were placed in mass graves, sometimes stacked atop one another, sometimes buried in shallow earth, with only a few moments of ceremony. In this hurried process, people in states of unconsciousness or deep coma could easily be mistaken for the dead. In some tragic instances, entire families would be buried in haste, only for one member to stir later, alone and sealed beneath the soil. These premature burials weren't limited to peasants or the poor. There are documented cases of nobles, priests, and even royalty being mistakenly buried alive. One particularly disturbing tale tells of a wealthy woman who was buried in her family crypt while in a coma. Later, when her tomb was reopened years later, her skeleton was found not in the coffin, but crumpled by the door, suggesting she had awoken, struggled to escape, and died in complete darkness, clawing at the sealed door in vain. Another story involves a man who had a grave accident and was pronounced dead, only to be discovered years later buried in his best clothing, his corpse twisted and contorted, his fingers worn down to the bone from trying to escape the coffin. Some accounts were passed down in religious records. Monasteries, which often kept detailed chronicles of daily life and death, would occasionally report inexplicable events. A monk who returned to consciousness after being laid out for burial, or a nun who revived during a funeral mass. In a world where the line between the natural and the supernatural was blurred, such events were often interpreted as miracles or signs from God. But even then, the underlying cause, mistaken death, remained disturbingly clear. Folklore added another layer of mystery to these stories. Across Europe, myths of revenants, beings who returned from the grave, may have had their origins in the phenomenon of premature burial. Villagers who claimed to see a dead neighbor walking the roads at night might not have been hallucinating. If that person had managed to escape their grave, or was never properly buried to begin with, their sudden reappearance would have terrified a deeply superstitious community. These tales fueled beliefs in vampires, ghouls, and the undead, ideas that still linger in popular culture today. Over time, the fear of being buried alive became a deeply rooted cultural anxiety. It appeared in literature, with authors like Edgar Allan Poe writing harrowing tales inspired by real events. Families began to take precautions. Some requested longer waiting periods before burial. Others insisted on elaborate rituals to ensure their loved ones were truly gone. A few even built mausoleums with doors that could be opened from the inside, just in case. Even those who survived the ordeal were forever changed. Historical records include rare but incredible accounts of individuals who were accidentally buried alive, rescued in time, and lived to tell the tale. These survivors often described a horrifying awakening, confined in darkness, unable to breathe, screaming for help that never came. Some lost their sanity. Others became obsessive about death, haunted by the knowledge of how close they had come to being buried forever. These real-life horror stories did more than frighten. They forced people to reckon with the frightening truth that medicine and custom could both fail. They left behind a legacy of fear and caution, a cultural memory that lives on in warnings, superstitions, and safety measures that would eventually emerge in later centuries. But during the Middle Ages, when knowledge was scarce and fear abundant, the grave remained a place not just for the dead, but for the tragically still living. As the centuries wore on and terrifying stories of premature burial continued to circulate, the fear of being buried alive grew into a widespread and deeply rooted cultural obsession. By the 17th and 18th centuries, this fear had evolved into something almost clinical. No longer just the subject of folklore or whispered tales, the phenomenon of accidental burial began to be addressed by thinkers, inventors, and even early medical professionals who sought ways to prevent such an unthinkable fate. Out of this fear, a strange and fascinating invention emerged: the safety coffin. Safety coffins, also known as security coffins or life-saving coffins, were designed with the explicit purpose of allowing someone who had been buried prematurely to alert the living above ground. These designs varied greatly depending on the time period, location, and the inventiveness of their creators. Some were relatively simple, a string tied to the wrist or finger of the buried individual, which was then connected to a bell above ground. If the person moved even slightly, the bell would ring, alerting the cemetery caretaker or anyone nearby. This is where the phrase "saved by the bell" is often mistakenly believed to have originated, though the true origins of the phrase lie elsewhere. Nevertheless, the concept was real, a literal lifeline for the wrongly entombed. Other versions of safety coffins were more elaborate. Some included ventilation tubes to allow fresh air into the coffin in case the buried person revived. Others had speaking tubes, essentially a primitive kind of intercom, that would allow the person to call for help. Some designs even had a small flag that would pop up from the ground if the person inside moved. A few extremely elaborate models had a glass window built into the coffin lid that could be viewed through a surface-level hatch. These precautions may sound extreme, even theatrical, but they reflected the very real and widespread anxiety people had about being buried alive. The rise of these devices coincided with a growing awareness of medicine as a developing science. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as anatomy and physiology became better understood, doctors began to study the processes of death more closely. But even with growing knowledge, there was still a lack of confidence in the ability to determine death with certainty. This lack of trust led some people, especially the wealthy and influential, to take matters into their own hands. Many aristocrats and intellectuals of the time left detailed instructions in their wills about how their bodies should be handled after death. Some asked for waiting periods of 24, 48, or even 72 hours before burial, just to be sure. Others requested that their bodies not be buried until clear signs of decomposition had appeared. One famous example is that of the German poet and philosopher Heinrich von Kleist, who, tormented by the fear of premature burial, asked to be stabbed in the heart before being laid to rest. Others, including physicians and surgeons of the time, took similar measures, choosing to have an artery severed or the heart punctured post-mortem to guarantee that they would not be buried alive. These were not irrational fears. At the time, medical errors were common, and misdiagnoses of death still occurred. Reports of resurrections at the morgue or just before burial appeared in newspapers and medical journals, fueling public paranoia. The concern over premature burial became so widespread that entire societies were formed to prevent it. In 1896, the Society for the Prevention of People Being Buried Alive was established in London. Its members advocated for better diagnostic procedures and legal mandates that would require longer observation periods before burial. They argued that traditional tests, like checking for breath or heartbeat by touch, were dangerously outdated, and that new methods needed to be developed and standardized. While the society may seem eccentric by today's standards, its mission reflected a real and pressing concern of the time. In some European countries, special waiting mortuaries, known as Leichenhäuser in German-speaking regions, were built. These were places where the dead were kept under observation for several days before being officially buried. In these facilities, corpses were laid out in rooms with attendants present around the clock. In some mortuaries, wires were attached to the hands of the deceased, leading to bells or alarms. If a body moved, even slightly, the staff could respond immediately. Although few people were ever found to be alive in these mortuaries, their existence reflects just how deep the fear of premature burial ran in the public imagination. Eventually, as medicine progressed and the ability to detect signs of life improved, with the invention of the stethoscope in the early 19th century and more sophisticated understanding of the circulatory and nervous systems, the number of confirmed premature burials began to decline. Autopsies, death certificates, and more regulated medical procedures became the norm in much of Europe and North America, significantly reducing the likelihood of such tragedies. Yet the cultural echoes of that fear remain with us today. The safety coffin, the delayed burial requests, the observation mortuaries, they all speak to a fundamental human anxiety. The terror of being conscious and helpless in the darkness, sealed beneath the earth, unable to call out. It is a fear not only of death, but of death misunderstood, misjudged, or prematurely enforced. In the Middle Ages, such fears were not merely the stuff of nightmares, they were part of everyday life. And while today we may laugh at the idea of bells attached to coffins, they represent a powerful truth. That for much of human history, the certainty of death was anything but certain.